In the year 1922, archaeologists opened an Egyptian tomb dating back roughly 3,200 years and found, sealed inside a jar, a solid white substance that had survived millennia underground. In 2018, scientists finally analyzed it and confirmed what many had suspected. It was cheese, likely the oldest solid cheese ever discovered, made from a mixture of cow and goat or sheep milk, and laced with a dangerous bacterium that could have killed anyone who ate it. That a food this old, this fragile, and this alive with bacteria could survive over 3,000 years says something remarkable about cheese itself. It is not simply food. It is engineered permanence, a way of taking something that spoils within hours and turning it into something that can outlast empires. That transformation, from perishable liquid to durable solid, changed how humans survived scarcity more than almost any other food technology in history. But cheese's story does not start in Egypt, or in the alpine caves of France, or on a factory line in Wisconsin. It starts in the stomach of a dead animal, somewhere in the ancient Fertile Crescent, roughly 8,000 years ago. In the region that is now the Middle East, early pastoralist communities had already domesticated goats and sheep and had learned to milk them. Milk was valuable, but it was also a problem. In the desert heat without refrigeration of any kind, raw milk would spoil within a matter of hours, turning sour and dangerous almost as fast as it was collected. For a herding society trying to build a stable food surplus, this was a serious limitation. Then, according to the most widely accepted theory among food historians, something accidental happened. A traveler, or a herder, carried milk in a pouch made from the dried stomach of a young ruminant animal, a common practical container in a world before pottery was widespread. The stomach lining of young ruminants contains an enzyme called rennet, whose natural biological purpose is to help baby animals digest their mother's milk. When milk sat inside one of these stomach pouches, exposed to rennet, warmth, and the natural movement of travel, it did something unexpected. It separated. Solid curds formed, floating in a thin, watery liquid called whey. Whoever first opened that pouch and tasted the result discovered something no human had ever deliberately made before. A solid, semi-preserved dairy food that lasted far longer than the milk it came from. Cheese had been invented almost certainly by accident as a solution to spoilage. For thousands of years after this discovery, cheese-making remained a matter of practical survival rather than culinary pleasure. Early cheeses were almost certainly crude, sour, and inconsistent, made without any scientific understanding of the bacteria and enzymes doing the actual work. But the core insight, that milk could be transformed into something that did not spoil, spread rapidly across the ancient world. Archaeological evidence of cheese strainers, pottery fragments perforated with small holes used to drain whey from curds, has been found at sites in Poland dating back roughly 7,500 years, suggesting the practice had already spread deep into Europe within a few thousand years of its likely origin in the Fertile Crescent. Sumerian clay tablets from around 5,000 years ago list cheese among rationed foods given to temple workers, evidence that by the dawn of written history, cheese was already established enough to be counted, measured, and distributed as a form of currency and sustenance. Around 2000 BC, Egyptian tomb paintings began depicting the milking of cows and the processing of dairy, and archaeological finds, like the tomb cheese mentioned earlier, confirm that cheesemaking had become sophisticated enough by then to be a standard part of Egyptian food culture, valued highly enough to be buried with the dead for the afterlife. It was ancient Greece and Rome, though, that turned cheese from a subsistence food into something closer to a codified craft. Homer's Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BC, contains a detailed description of the Cyclops Polyphemus making cheese from sheep and goat milk inside his cave, curdling it, draining it in woven baskets, and storing the finished wheels on shelves, a description so technically accurate that food historians still cite it as one of the earliest detailed accounts of cheesemaking technique in Western literature. Greek physicians, much like early Indian physicians did with sugar, and Arab physicians would later do with coffee, prescribed cheese medicinally, believing it aided digestion and provided strength for athletes and soldiers. Greek Olympic athletes reportedly incorporated cheese heavily into their training diets, treating it as a performance food centuries before the term existed. The Romans, however, are who truly industrialized cheese production across an empire. Roman writers like Columella, in his first-century agricultural treatise, laid out detailed instructions for cheese-making, describing rennet sources, curdling temperatures, pressing techniques, and even smoking methods for preservation, essentially the first known technical manual for the craft. Roman legions, much like American Civil War soldiers, would, with coffee 18 centuries later, carried hard, aged cheese as a critical field ration, prized because it was lightweight, calorie-dense, and, crucially, did not spoil on long marches across the empire's vast road network. As Rome's legions and merchants moved across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, they carried cheese-making techniques with them, seeding regional traditions that would evolve independently for centuries afterward into England's early cheddar-style cheeses, Gaul's soft-ripened varieties, and the hard-grating cheeses of the Italian peninsula. Roman writers marveled at the variety already emerging across the provinces they controlled, with different regions favoring different milks, climates, and techniques, an early sign of the geographic specialization that still defines cheese culture today. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, something surprising happened. Cheesemaking, rather than fading with the infrastructure that had spread it, was preserved and refined in one of the few institutions still capable of maintaining continuity through the chaos of early medieval Europe, the monastery. Christian monks across France, Italy, and Switzerland had both the incentive and the stability to perfect cheesemaking over generations. Monastic religious calendars required extended periods of fasting from meat, sometimes lasting weeks or months at a time, and cheese, rich in protein and fat, became an essential substitute that monks were permitted to eat even on the strictest fasting days. Monasteries also had something almost no one else in medieval Europe possessed: land stability, literate record-keeping, and multi-generational institutional memory, which allowed cheese-making recipes and techniques to be refined, documented, and passed down with a precision that illiterate peasant households simply could not match. Many of the world's most famous cheeses trace their documented origins directly to monastic production during this period. Munster cheese takes its name from an Alsatian monastery founded in the 7th century. Trappist monks across Belgium and France developed washed-rind cheeses alongside their famous beers. Italian monasteries in the Po Valley are widely credited with developing the techniques that led to Parmesan and similar hard-grating cheeses by the 12th century, cheeses so durable they could be aged for years and traded across enormous distances without spoiling, turning cheese once again into a form of currency, much as sugar and later coffee would become. By the height of the medieval period, cheese had become deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of European life, but in a very different way than sugar or coffee ever were. Where sugar was locked behind apothecary counters as a luxury for royalty, cheese remained overwhelmingly a food of the peasantry and working class, a practical, calorie-dense way to preserve the surplus milk that would otherwise spoil after a good season of grazing. This is one of the most important distinctions in cheese's history compared to other transformative commodities. It was rarely a symbol of aristocratic wealth. It was a technology of resilience for ordinary people, a way for a farming family to survive winter or a famine or a bad harvest by converting a perishable surplus into something that could be stored in a cellar for months or years. That said, certain aged and elaborate cheeses did eventually become prized luxury exports. Wheels of aged Parmesan were valuable enough by the late medieval period that they were sometimes used as loan collateral, and there are documented cases from Renaissance-era Italy of wealthy families depositing enormous wheels of cheese in banks as a literal, edible form of savings alongside gold and grain. The specific character of European cheese, its overwhelming regional diversity, is itself a direct product of medieval feudal geography. Because transportation across medieval Europe was slow, dangerous, and expensive, cheesemaking techniques developed in near-total isolation from valley to valley, region to region, each shaped by local climate, local grasses, local animal breeds, and, crucially, local strains of naturally occurring bacteria and mold living in the air of specific caves and cellars. This is why Roquefort, one of history's oldest documented blue cheeses, can trace its unique flavor directly to the specific limestone caves near the French village of the same name, where a naturally occurring mold called Penicillium roqueforti has lived in the rock for millennia. Legend holds that a young shepherd, distracted by a passing girl, abandoned a lunch of bread and ewe's milk cheese in one of these caves, only to return months later and find it transformed by mold into something pungent and unexpectedly delicious. Whether or not that specific story is true, French King Charles VI granted the villagers of Roquefort exclusive rights to age cheese in those caves in 1411. Making it one of the earliest documented examples of a protected geographic food designation in European history, a legal concept that eventually evolved into the modern protected designation of origin labels still used to certify Parmigiano Reggiano, Roquefort, and hundreds of other regional cheeses today. This is the part of cheese's history that most people never learn about, and it is the part that eventually turned a peasant preservation technique into a global industry. The arrival of science. For nearly 8,000 years, cheesemaking had been guided entirely by observation, tradition, and trial and error, with no one actually understanding the biological mechanisms at work. That began to change in the mid-1800s, when French chemist Louis Pasteur's groundbreaking research into fermentation and microorganisms, the same research that led to the process now known as pasteurization, gave cheesemakers for the first time a scientific explanation for why some batches of cheese turned out perfectly while others spoiled or developed dangerous bacteria. Pasteur's work did not just explain cheese, it made it safer and more consistent, laying the scientific foundation for controlling exactly which bacterial cultures were introduced into milk, rather than relying on whatever wild bacteria happened to be present in a particular barn or cave. The Industrial Revolution then did to cheese exactly what it had already done to sugar and coffee. It took a labor-intensive artisanal product and turned it into a mass-produced commodity. In 1851, a New York dairy farmer named Jesse Williams opened what is widely credited as the first cheese factory in the United States, in the town of Rome, New York, combining the milk from multiple neighboring farms into a single centralized production facility using standardized techniques rather than the individual, inconsistent methods of dozens of separate farmhouses. The results were more uniform, more efficient to produce, and dramatically cheaper. Within decades, factory-style cheesemaking had spread across the American Midwest, and Wisconsin in particular, with its ideal dairy farming climate and large population of Northern and Central European immigrants who brought centuries of cheesemaking tradition with them, became the undisputed center of American cheese production, a title the state still holds today. Refrigeration technology, developed through the late 1800s and early 1900s, solved a problem that had haunted cheesemakers since the beginning: the inability to control temperature precisely during aging, freeing production from the geographic constraints that had defined it for thousands of years. Then, in 1916, a Canadian cheesemaker and inventor named James Louis Kraft patented a process for pasteurizing and blending cheese into a smooth, incredibly shelf-stable product that could be packaged in tins and shipped without refrigeration at all. This invention, which would become known as processed cheese, was a devastating blow to spoilage, but also, in the eyes of many food traditionalists, a betrayal of everything cheese had represented for 8,000 years: complexity, regional identity, and slow, patient craftsmanship. Kraft's processed cheese became enormously profitable almost immediately. The United States government purchased millions of pounds of it to feed soldiers during the First and Second World Wars, prizing it for exactly the same reasons Roman legions once prized aged hard cheese. It was cheap, durable, calorie-dense, and did not spoil during transport to the front lines. By the mid-20th century, processed cheese slices had become a fixture of the American diet, wrapped individually in plastic, sold in supermarkets across the country, representing the absolute opposite end of the spectrum from a wheel of raw milk cheese aged for years in a French limestone cave. This split between industrial and traditional artisanal cheese defines much of cheese's story through the second half of the 20th century. As factory production made cheese cheaper and more accessible than ever before, consumption soared across the industrialized world. The average American, who consumed roughly 4 pounds of cheese per year in 1970, was consuming well over 30 pounds annually by the early 2000s, a nearly 8-fold increase in a single human lifetime, driven heavily by the explosive growth of one particular delivery mechanism: pizza. The rise of national pizza chains through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s turned melted mozzarella into one of the single largest drivers of American cheese consumption. With the dairy industry itself working closely with fast food companies, actively promoting cheese-heavy menu items through coordinated marketing campaigns designed to move surplus milk production, campaigns not entirely unlike the way British merchants once actively pushed sugar consumption because it made their colonies wealthy. But even as industrial cheese conquered supermarket shelves, a counter-movement began emerging in the final decades of the 20th century, one that mirrored almost exactly the specialty coffee third wave that would follow a generation later. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 90s, small-scale farmstead cheesemakers across the United States, inspired by European traditions and a growing consumer appetite for authenticity, began reviving raw milk and artisanal techniques that industrial production had nearly erased. Farmers' markets, specialty cheese shops, and eventually entire cheese-focused culinary competitions sprang up, treating cheese with the same reverence wine connoisseurs reserve for vineyards, obsessing over specific herds, specific pastures, and specific aging caves. American artisanal cheesemakers began winning international awards, previously dominated entirely by centuries-old European producers, a remarkable turnaround for a country whose cheese industry had spent much of the 20th century defined by individually wrapped plastic slices. Today, the scale of global cheese production and consumption is almost as staggering as sugars or coffees. Global cheese production exceeds 25 million metric tons yearly, with the United States now the largest producer, followed closely by Germany and France. The European Union alone produces close to 10 million tons annually, protecting over 1,500 regional cheeses under geographic designation laws, descended directly from that 1411 Roquefort ruling. France alone recognizes more than 1,000 distinct named cheese varieties, giving rise to a famous, possibly apocryphal quote attributed to Charles de Gaulle, who reportedly complained it was impossible to govern a country with that many kinds of cheese. Cheese's environmental footprint has also become a subject of growing scrutiny in a pattern that echoes the modern reckonings faced by sugar and coffee. Dairy farming, the essential first step in cheesemaking, is a significant source of methane emissions and land and water use, and some studies find that certain hard, aged cheeses carry a carbon footprint comparable to some cuts of beef, since it can take roughly 10 pounds of milk to produce 1 pound of hard cheese. This has driven growing interest in plant-based cheese alternatives. and in newer biotechnology approaches using precision fermentation, in which genetically engineered microorganisms are used to produce actual dairy proteins without a cow ever being involved at all, an approach several food technology startups are racing to bring to commercial scale in what may become the next major technological rupture in cheese's history. Just as the Dutch smuggling live coffee plants or Napoleon's beet sugar research once represented ruptures in their respective stories. Cheese's story spans 8,000 years, nearly every inhabited continent, and a transformation from pure survival technology to peasant staple to monastic craft to industrial commodity to modern luxury good, sometimes all at once, depending on which wheel you happen to be holding. It was there when a nameless traveler in the ancient Fertile Crescent discovered that milk did not have to spoil. It was there when Roman legions marched across Europe with hard cheese in their packs. It was there when monks, forbidden from eating meat, perfected recipes still used unchanged today. It was there when a distracted shepherd may or may not have left his lunch in a cave and returned to find it transformed. It was there when industrial factories in New York and Wisconsin turned an artisanal craft into a mass commodity, and it was there again when a new generation of farmers deliberately turned back toward the slow, patient methods their industrial grandparents had abandoned. And it is here now, in your refrigerator, on your pizza, in the wedge on a cheese board at a party, in the individually wrapped slice in a child's lunchbox, carrying inside it 8,000 years of humans trying to solve the same simple problem. How do you make something that spoils in a day last for a lifetime? An accident inside the stomach of a dead animal became one of the most enduring food technologies in human history. It fed legions. It sustained monasteries through centuries of fasting. It built entire regional economies protected by law. And somewhere in a cave, a cellar, or a climate-controlled factory right now, a wheel of it is sitting quietly in the dark, waiting, patiently, the way it always has, to become something worth eating.